Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Luke Sheehy, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Universities Australia, and it's so good for you and all of us to have a conversation today as launch our solution series in conversation. And what better way to do it with Dr. Kate Cornick, CEO of the Tech Council, also a member of the SERD panel, a member of one of our university councils, and all-round legend in our sector. Kate, it's a delight to have you here. Can I obviously start by acknowledging that I'm coming to you from the lands of the Kaurna people and pay my respects to elders past and present, and extend that acknowledgement and courtesy to any Indigenous Australians joining us today, and also acknowledge the various lands from which you're all coming to us on this conversation online today. But Kate, a very warm welcome to you, and thank you for joining me in this conversation today.
Thank you very much for having me, and I'm joining from the Wurundjeri lands of the Kulin Nation here in Melbourne.
Well, wonderful, and that's my hometown, so I look forward to getting back there. But I can say to everyone, it is a beautiful day here in southern parts of Adelaide. I'm on the Flinders campus, and I've had a great couple of days here in Adelaide. Lots of things on the agenda. We've a week out from the federal budget and lots of things on our minds as universities. It could be governance and funding, but productivity and research and how we support our friends in industries, particularly the tech industry, but also our role in the research ecosystem. Lots of topics that I want to get through with you today, Kate. And for everyone listening, this will become part of Universities Australia's longer term engagement with our members and our broader friends and supporters across Australia and beyond, hopefully, in a series of conversations. So, Kate, this is the first one. I'm so delighted that you're joining me. Let's get started with our conversation and see where we land. People, please feel free to add some questions. We'll do a bit of a Q&A at the end. It'll be moderated by my team, so I'll read some of those questions out. If you don't get a chance, we apologise. It's our first time. We'll get better as we go on. Kate, we saw some initial down payment in the rollout of the Strategic Examination of Research and Development, the so-called SERD, in the budget. Some of the things that Universities Australia have been asking for, including a research council across government to better coordinate. We have a really big ambition at Universities Australia, particularly that the Commonwealth defragment the way that they fund research. That's been a big part of your work. It is a really important report. How did you go about it? You're tasked with this enormous thing. It's like, take the entirety of the Commonwealth's contribution and coordination of research, and what you just left with your own devices. It's a huge undertaking. So firstly, congratulations on the final report. Secondly, congratulations on the government's initial response. But I'm really interested in how it all happened.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, can I start by saying it was a real honour to be appointed to that panel, and particularly with such preeminent Australians. Robin Denholm, our chair of Tesla, it's the first time I'd met her, and she was absolutely phenomenal to work with. Much better known to the sector would be Emeritus Professor Ian Chubb, who is just absolutely phenomenal, and what an amazing Australian, and had such deep history about the many reviews that have preceded us, and such deep knowledge of the university sector. And of course, former Australian of the Year, Professor Fiona Wood, and her lived experience of commercialising technology. So it was, I have to say, I had real imposter syndrome when I was asked to join. I very much recognised that I was a much more junior member of the team, but I was asked to come along with my startup experience in particular, and bring that to the table. And it was a real privilege to do it. I was asked in late 2024, doesn't seem like that long ago, and was told that it wouldn't take too much time. Oh my goodness, was that a statement that was countered and proven to be very long. The reality is it did chew up an enormous amount of time, but such an important topic, and a real honour to work alongside Robin, Ian and Fiona to tackle with what I believe is some of Australia's most challenging questions. And I also want to acknowledge the Secretariat, led by Dom English, many of you would know, and his team, who did an enormous amount of work to support our efforts, including responding to our many questions and queries about what has happened and gone, and gathering huge amounts of data and papers for us to consider and deliberate. We met every week, if not more frequently. It was a very intense year last year, and certainly the final quarter of last year, you can imagine, was, I think Ian and I miss having each other on speed dial, to be honest with you. We were, as with Robin, Fiona, but Ian and myself in particular, were very much on speed dial around this university sector issues. I don't profess to have the experience that Ian does, but I have held both academic very briefly in my career at Melbourne University. I have a PhD from Melbourne University. I have had a professional career at Melbourne University as director of a research institute, as well as a director of innovation and industry engagement. So I know the university sector relatively well, and I also sit on council at Charles Sturt University. So it was a privilege to be able to lean into, in particular, Chapter 2, which focused on university sector.
Yeah, and look, we're so grateful for the work that you've done, and of course, universities are supportive of us getting on with the job of making the SERD recommendations a reality in the fullest way we possibly can. We believe you have very small windows in public policy, and I think the timing is right. And your background, of course, as you've already pointed out, is really important. And the linkage, and the important linkage, and the increasing linkage between universities and the broader startup and tech industry. Of course, before you've just joined the Tech Council, and I know you've only been there a few weeks, and I've known the Tech Council since it was born several years ago, and I'm delighted to have seen you take up that role, and I look forward to working with you in closer collaboration over the period ahead. Before you're at the Tech Council, of course, you were at Launch Vic. Victorian state government's always had a kind of edge, I think, in many respects, on that kind of sweet spot between universities and industry collaboration and incubating new ideas and of course advanced manufacturing and other things that happen. So we obviously can see that influence that you've brought to the SERD report. I wonder, just thinking about your new job, which is, what we've billed you as coming in today. So you've come into the Tech Council. Tech Council's been around for about 5 years now. I've worked closely in the past in my previous roles at ATN with Kate Pounder and, of course, Damien Kasabji. You're coming in. What are your priorities for your role in the Tech Council, and how can we help as universities in that?
Well, needless to say, coming off the back of the SERD review, I'm particularly interested in an ambitious Australia, and I think that applies to technology across the board. And I really look forward to advocating very strongly for the recommendations that we put in that report, and making sure that we're really leveraging our fullest potential when it comes to the technology sector in Australia, which is now an incredibly important part of our economy. And really understanding how we can grow that and how we can really leverage that to build a future Australia that is productive, resilient, has sovereign capability, but is also inherently ambitious in its DNA.
One of the things I remember about the Tech Council's initial splash on the scene was a big focus on the skills we needed to build a kind of global industry in Australia, not just be at the end of the line, but be at the centre of the conversation globally. AI is disrupting the way we think about some of those things. And I know we talked about this in advance of this discussion. We could possibly spend the next 6 hours talking about AI, but I wonder, how does that change and disrupt, not only the Tech Council's work that you're thinking about over the next period ahead, but also just generally the industry's approach to workforce, to infrastructure needs. Obviously, there's a lot of discussion in Australia now about our data capability and AI capability. That's enormously different from even 5 years ago. So how are you grappling with that, and how do we better understand it more broadly in the university sector?
Well, the first thing I say is very early days. I think I've just clip 2 weeks at TCA. So obviously
you're an expert
I'm an
already.
old hand now. This is obviously something that will be very high on the agenda. It's a very unique moment in our industrialization and our economy. But having said that, there's been plenty of other disruptive points that have gone before us. The Tender's speech the other day with Andrew Lee talked about the agricultural industrial revolution. You can think about computerization and the dot-com era. And here we are in AI. I think one of the interesting things about AI is that previously technology has imposed disruption on other sectors. This is the first time that technology has potentially imposed the most disruption on itself so far. And so we've seen a lot of changes, and we've certainly read the headlines about what AI is doing to job disruption, particularly in the software industry. And, there are real challenges around that. But there are also real opportunities here. And there are two things that I think are really pertinent to this debate. One is that, and it goes back to startups. We in Victoria have been monitoring our startup ecosystem with my Launch Vic hat on for a decade, and we're still seeing jobs growth at a very rapid rate in Victoria. And that is because the small companies are being created at a rapid rate, and they need those software engineers. They're crying out for them, and they need great talent to come in and help them. It's not realistic to think that many companies are going to get off the ground by putting a prompt into one of our AI tools and having a company pop out the other end. There's certainly a view that that can happen. And if we think back to when the Apple iPhone came about, there was a bit of a buzz around who's the first millionaire, sole founder, app developer. And, there were certainly a lot of small scale people that really benefited and developed cute apps for us to use. But as the industry's matured, we've got apps that are really seriously helping us with our workflow and our productivity and our personal lives. And those companies, many of them household names, are companies with thousands of employees and thousands of engineers. So I think we need a perspective where, yes, there are going to be companies that are going to be thinking about their job and their workforce, and do they need to contract? But there's also, it's never been more important to have new companies being created, not only to take advantage and bring about the new business models, but also recognizing they're job creators and they're going to be sucking up those jobs. And so, certainly in Victoria, we have not seen a slowing down of job creation in the startup sector alone. I think that goes back to the importance of SERD. Obviously, set alongside this for the university sector is broader disruption into the economy, and also broader innovation opportunity that needs to be diffused throughout the economy to make sure that our businesses across the board are taking advantage of AI. And rather than being railroaded by disruption, we actually look at this as how do we become leaders in our own rights, in our own domains. And that's a very big upskilling, reskilling, reimagining, and a great deal of entrepreneurship that has to happen. And I think that's, much like digital literacy and the digital economy was an issue, I think we really have to focus on that. And I think the university sector is doing great work in really helping guide that. And in many ways, the universities have had to adopt and adapt so quickly to our students who have been, rapid adopters of AI. And how does that go with work and examinations and all the rest of it? So I am probably sit more on the optimistic side. We have to very strongly recognize the disruption that's happening, but I also see this as an incredible opportunity for our economy, for our entrepreneurs, and also, quite frankly, people who are not, a few decades, two decades ago, you needed a huge amount of money to start a company. You don't today. So there's an egalitarianism to this that's making opportunity much more accessible to everyone. So I definitely am an optimist, and I see that there's huge opportunity, but that doesn't take away from the fact that we do need to really understand disruption, reskilling, upskilling, etc., to make sure we can take advantage of this.
There's so many things I want to kind of come from that and lean into. But one thing is, it's nice to hear some optimism coming out of my home state of Victoria on jobs growth, because I think the national story is all a bit like, state government debt and you can't do anything in Victoria. But I think there is a genuine, particularly for places like Victoria, not as resource rich as other parts of the country. So the make your own luck factor is really important. former manufacturing states like South Australia are doing similar things, investing in their universities, investing in knowledge and capability. That's really, really exciting. And Kate, the optimism is infectious, and hopefully that carries on to the policymakers in Canberra and beyond. A couple of things I think, though. The role of universities in that broader ecosystem. You've obviously come from Victoria. There's been, excellent engagement, I think, between industrial transformation in Victoria and the university sector. That's a big opportunity for us, particularly as we work with AI, but also universities' role in nurturing and incubating new businesses and startups. As you said rightly, in the past, businesses need an enormous amount of capital to get up and going. What universities can obviously offer is space, capability, some of the support and mentoring for new businesses, including other practical things like HR, financial literacy, all those other things. What have you seen in the past, and do you think, how can we as universities think about our role more broadly and remind policymakers in the industry that we're here and we're a really important and enormous resource, frankly?
Yeah, absolutely. You did say we had 6 hours, right? This is my absolute pet project, and I think thinking about how we create startups, this is what I've been doing for the last 10 years in Victoria, and we very proudly grew the number of startups fourfold from 1,000 to over 4,000. And by the way, the economic value of those companies rose over 20 times, from 5 billion to over 140 billion. So we've certainly shown the model, and universities have a key role in that. But I also think it's about getting a real understanding of that role. And I think that's something that is not always incredibly well understood, and both within the university sector and outside the university sector. So I think there's a huge amount of pressure on universities to commercialize technology, and that's great. We should be commercializing technology. But let's not forget that the vast majority of entrepreneurs sit outside of the university system altogether. So in Australia, it's about 96% of entrepreneurs, we discovered through the SERD process, don't have an affiliation with the university. They're creating businesses outside of the system. So 4% are directly affiliated spin-outs or associated with a program delivered by the university. In the US, it's not much different. It's 10%. So US are a bit better than us, but it's certainly the vast majority of startups are coming from people who are in industry. The average age of an entrepreneur in Silicon Valley is about 42. The average age of a startup entrepreneur in Victoria is about 42. So
interesting. So maybe, I'm a little after 42, but not that far. Maybe it's my time, Kate.
You and me both.
Who knows?
You and me both.
But that's an interesting challenge, isn't it? And a provocation to some of the things that we assume that universities have, we obviously have an important role to play in that ecosystem. And I think there's obviously a challenge for us as universities to have more happening on our campuses. I think we're really fertile ground in terms of the capability we've got, the infrastructure, the knowledge, the students, there's so much. And also importantly, and this came up in discussions we had as a sector around the productivity roundtable, our connections to the rest of the world. Universities are highly globally engaged. Sometimes that's contested, but often it is, on really important and mutually beneficial work. And there is a role we can play, and if American universities are at 10%, I think that's at least a target we could reach. How can we do that better? Then I guess is my question, Kate. And ought we do it better, or are we getting in the way?
Absolutely, we should be doing it better. But there's one other thing that I'd like to say, which I also think is in favour of the universities, is that when I talk about those 90% or 96% of entrepreneurs that are working outside of the system, many of them are deep tech or AI, and they're using knowledge that's being created. And we must not forget, they may not be able to cite the researchers that have gone before them that have created the knowledge for them to be able to innovate. So think of AI, all these AI startup founders that are out there working. There have been paper publications since 1956 on artificial intelligence. There's a body of research that's being created in our academic community that if that had not happened, they would not be able to innovate. Now, they may not be able to cite those papers, but often it goes unforgotten that they stand on the shoulder of giants. And I really feel very passionately that we need to be thinking about our academic community as the resource for the next 30, 50 years of knowledge creation. And sometimes we get a bit too focused on, hang on, universities, can you create more economic outcome right now? And so that is something that's very near and dear to me. I totally see the opportunity to create potential right now, and I'll come to your question in 1 second. But let's not forget the important, critical role of universities in our economy is not about creating innovation for tomorrow. It's providing the platform to create the innovations in 20, 30, 50 years time. And take that out of the system, Australia will be worse off. And I think very sadly that I feel that's not widely recognised in across the broader Australian economy. So back to the question about how do we do it?
Well, I think just quickly before you get to that, I think you've summed up one of the challenges we have, which is applied research and research commercialisation, which is fundamentally important to what we do in universities and really important for the nation, is, often what's, lent upon by politicians during election campaigns. And we understand that there's a practical realness to it, and voters and the broader public can understand what it is because it does something or it creates a product. But you've absolutely landed one of the most cogent and elegant defences of why we need discovery research and that pipeline in the university sector, and to continue to invest in it. I suspect some of your thinking came through pretty loudly in the SERD report, because that was also in there. And we're grateful for that, because you're right, we have to make the case, and sometimes it's our friends in industry, like Tech Council and tech industry, but others, to remind policymakers that it's what we don't know today that will help us know things tomorrow. And if we don't have clever people who spend their lives wondering and imagining and thinking and discovering and researching that discovery at our universities and in other important research institutions in this country, we'll never have anything to spin off into the commercial world. But anyway, I just needed to give you that thank you and that plug for making such an elegant defence of discovery research.
I feel like I'm channeling Ian Chubb right now. And the other thing that I know he would want me to say is Australia produces 3% of the world's knowledge off a very small base, which we should be very proud of. But it's the researchers that help us engage with the 97% of knowledge created elsewhere in the world that is also vitally important to our future. We can't think of the Australian system as being isolated. And so it is, there is a really, really undervalued role of foundational research that is just so critically important. But I'm more than happy to talk for the next 5 hours and 55 minutes about how we create startups and what universities can do.
Just to make sure some other people get a Guernsey, so I've just remind folks that are listening and that they can post some questions, and I'll try and get them through my team and moderate them back and get them to Kate towards the end of this discussion, which we're going to run out of time, of course. But I'm conscious that you didn't get an opportunity to answer the role of universities in that question. Then I want to touch on some of the things about what I'd like to describe as really Australia's innovation moment, right? Where are we at, and some of the things that we talked about at our Solutions Summit back in February. Mark Esposito, who's a futurist from Harvard University, said, Australia risks becoming a technology colony, right? And that we don't have the right capability and investment in things like our own satellite technology and other things, but there is an inflection point, or a point where we can actually think about that. Universities, innovation, the SERD report, that's a really important moment. So a couple of reflections on the role of universities, Kate, and then let's get stuck into what Australia can do and what Australia can build if we think about all of the natural and important ingredients we have to really make our own luck into the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do very much agree with that. We are in a moment right now, and I think there is a huge opportunity to step forward and really take advantage of that and reimagine what our economy is going to be like in the next 50, 100 years. And this is not an Australian problem, this is a global problem, but we are on the cusp of massive change being driven by technology and the likes of AI, and how that is going to roll out is something that we either sit back and fear or we lean into and lead. And I'm always someone who's going to lean into and lead. So, going back to that question about how do we do that, I think it's about making sure that we are, number one, fostering the next generation of workers and university students to be inspired and by entrepreneurship. And entrepreneurship is not just around technology people. pretty much an even split. Half of our entrepreneurs in Victoria were tech educated, and the other half were humanities, business, everything else. And so we need to make sure that anyone who's got that scratch gets to itch it, and making sure that universities have got avenues to explore that is really, really important. I think the university programming around entrepreneurship, which we see in a lot of universities, is doing great things. Part of the challenges there is that there are also private sector operators, and we've seen in Australia, in Victoria, how those private sector operators that are often backed by venture capital funds really excel and exceed the output from the university systems. And that might be a bit challenging for some to hear, but I think it also goes to the sorts of people that are running those programs. The private operators are often run by serial entrepreneurs that have had exits, run startups, got real experience. And then when you're trying to build a program in a university, you're trying to fit a salary into a Hugh structure, which may not be the same caliber of salary that we're seeing in the private sector. So you're attracting a different sort of people. But having said that, universities are incredibly powerful conveners. And I would argue every university across this country has got alumni in their midst who are doing awesome stuff in the tech sector and in innovation. And so tapping into them and bringing them back into the university, and use those program leaders to really connect and inspire and connect the next generation of students with your alumni cohort is incredibly powerful. And there's a real role in that. And then for the more experienced, once you've got real supply of startups coming through and you're really changing the culture within the university around entrepreneurship, there's been hugely successful programs in several universities, including Melbourne, around venture capital. And I think, I chair the Genesis Fund at the University of Melbourne. I chair the investment committee, and we're really seeing amazing companies come through that fund, and also the culture change that having a VC on campus is doing. Now, a VC at every university is probably not right. You've got to have the right amount of startups to come through to make the VC viable. And it's not, a typical VC fund might make 10 investments. A private sector VC might be looking at 1,000 different companies to choose those 10 investments. In a university, that's unrealistic, but you certainly want to know you've got 100 different ideas to sift between to pick out your 10 investments. So it's horses for courses, and it depends where different universities at. And I certainly don't advocate a one size fits all, but there are some really stellar lights in the Australian university system where you can see great programs that are making a real difference to this ambition and driving a future in technology startups.
There certainly is so many wonderful programs right across, our 38 members, and I've had the great privilege of getting to meet many of them over my travels in this job and previous ones. And a big shout out, of course, to, as a long-standing, long-suffering professional staff member in the university sector, professional staff play such an important role in this space, right? Linking Absolutely. The world of universities and translating that to the world of industry, which often can feel incompatible. It's often very compatible, but it's just systems and processes don't talk to each other. And of course, so much work has happened in the last kind of decade in particular around incentivising academic staff and the promotion structure and other things to have but research and industry links as part of that general overall part of their engagement framework and their promotions framework. And that's really changed, I think, a lot of the way that we do our business. And of course, really important programs. And we've lost a really iconic program in the Australian Economic Accelerator in the budget. That is a disappointment, but we are hopeful that we'll get some future investment through SERD, and that there is an opportunity really now with the framework that you've helped put together to help the university sector sit within this broader R&D ecosystem, the Commonwealth doing its part, better coordination, less fragmentation, a recognition of discovery research. And I think it's really important. Kate, there are some questions coming through the system, but so I'm gonna pose a few of them for you. This is what I was looking down before, because when you're remote, I've got it on my mobile just coming through. I did get up early on the weekend to vote for Eurovision, so it's reminding me of those kind of furious votes I tried to get over for Delta by using a UK number, but it didn't work. But nonetheless, we digress, as we usually do when it's a conversation with me. A couple of questions. There's one on the research tax incentive. I want to come to that in a minute. But global engagement, obviously, it's a really interesting thing. We've talked about the role of being globally engaged. This time last year, we were having some real difficulties with the Trump administration writing to individual researchers in our universities, and we wanting to look for more stable and reliable partners. Horizon Europe has been a long-held ambition for Australia and Australian universities and researchers to join. We're finally nearly there, and that's exciting. I just wonder if you want to make a reflection, and this has come through the audience, on the importance of those global connections. Do you think Horizon Europe will make a big difference for Australia's innovation moment?
Look, I think global connection is absolutely vital, and to take it back to the sector that I know and love in technology, there's no such thing as a business that engages in Australia in the tech sector that cannot be global. We need to be thinking global, and so that goes to having relationships, partnerships, and everything else in between with our global partners. And I think the same goes for the universities. I don't confess to know enough about Horizon Europe to know whether it will or will not achieve our dreams of where we need to play, but I certainly see it as a really positive development for the sector. And I think we absolutely need to be engaging. It goes back to Ian Chubb's statistics around 97% of knowledge is produced outside of Australia. We have to engage with that knowledge. If we're not engaging with it, we're a missed opportunity. It's knowing, less than 3% of the story and then expect us to be globally leading. That's just not the way it works. So global engagement is absolutely critical from an academic sense, but also more acutely in a startup sense and across the business sector.
There's another question that kind of flows on from that quite well. Is someone's talked about the SERD recommendations and the interdependency within those recommendations, right? So obviously the broader ecosystem, the role of government, the role of universities, the role of business. Is there a risk if the implementation only goes to just things that cost very little money and at just what we can do that are small, which we've seen, I think, with the universities accord. There's been some big ticket items for students, which is great, and then some of the more in supporting students to get into university. Very clear message from people around SERD that we need to implement it in full. Can you unpack some of those interdependencies that we need to get right in order to get SERD right?
Absolutely. And absolutely. We see the as a panel, we see the recommendations as being independent, and we certainly don't advocate for cherry picking. We are trying to solve for a whole system. And for those that have read the SERD report, there's a flywheel that features very high up in the document. It starts off with we need research. We need foundational research to build knowledge. I've spoken about that. That knowledge has then got to be translated into businesses. Those businesses have to grow. If they grow, we create jobs. They have to export. They become globally competitive. They become wealthy. They create exits. Those exits create wealth, and they create confidence for people to reinvest. And when I say people, it's both government and also the private sector that reinvest back into the foundational research. So the flywheel goes on. And the reality is we don't have that flywheel working effectively at the moment. And so we, through the SERD review, I cannot tell you how many times people cited Cochlear and CSL as our shining stars, as they should be. But let's face it, those companies were founded last century. Like we need more of those, and they certainly exist in the software sector. We've got Atlassian and Canva, and we can cite a few others. But again, we don't have many of them. And so we really need to think about how we're creating those next generation of businesses that are going to build real confidence and prosperity for Australia that can then be reinvested back in to the fundamental work, which is ultimately foundational research. And so I think there is a long way to go, and cherry picking risks us only focusing on, well, let's grow companies. Well, that's great if we grow companies, but we're forgetting to fund the foundational research that seeds those companies. We're not going to really kick that flywheel off in entirety. So we very much advocate for as a panel for all the recommendations to come forward. Having said that, we certainly don't expect government to adopt all those recommendations and do it in one go. And we welcome the budget outcomes because there were some progress towards some of the recommendations, in particular the National Resilience and Science Council, which quite frankly is the very first thing that should happen, is rethinking the governance of the sector. I was quite stunned to find through one of the early meetings in SERD that we were actually responsible for looking at over 150 and up to 193 programs spread across 13 ministries in the federal government alone. That is not a coordinated R&D system. We really need focus and better governance and better coordination, and that in itself will make a very big change to the way the sector operates. So we welcome the budget measures as a really positive first step, but we absolutely need to keep the pressure on to make sure everything gets recommended.
Yeah, and absolutely agree with you there, Kate. It's really important, and that important that it come from the first budget after the report was released. Otherwise, you risk that the further along the road you get, the less influence you have in getting government to move on these things, and the Coordination Council will be really, really important. And we recognise at Universities Australia just how fragmented the federal government's own approach to research and funding research has been, with so many different programs, so many different rules, so many different arrangements, in and of itself actually a regulatory burden, something I've been talking about earlier today. But
and also the sheer amount of time academics have to spend applying for them, which we talk about productivity, is just unproductive work if the success rates are so low, and yet we're making our academics do all this work to apply for grants. It's a very challenging environment.
Oh, look, it really is a very challenging environment. Conscious of time, one of the other big things I think is obviously incentives in the system. Mm-hmm. The RDTI, the Research Development Tax Incentive in Australia, has long been talked about. It's talked about in both the SERD report. There's some discussion around it in the budget. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if we could come back to some basic principles, because I think there's often a lot of assumed knowledge about how RDTI works. But in your experience, what should an RDTI tax incentive do, and what can we do to improve it, and how can universities play a role with small to medium enterprise and also larger businesses in leveraging our know-how and their R&D investment in that space?
Well, RDTI
not a small question there, Kate,
not a small question. It was. I was going to say there's pretty much a whole chapter dedicated to it in the SERD report. And the reality is RDTI does different things at different stages. And the RDTI scheme in Australia is trying to do an awful lot across the economy. Now, that's not a bad thing, but it's doing everything from helping a nascent deep tech company that's trying to get off the ground through to, supporting our largest corporates. And there are people who will turn around, and I think most people will agree supporting R&D at the front end of the funnel is really important. But I certainly heard plenty of views through the SERD consultations of people concerned about why are these corporates getting this R&D incentive. And I think what people forget is that R&D is an incredibly global competitive landscape. And those R&D intensive companies like Cochlear, like CSL, are being courted by other governments around the world who are offering them very nice incentives to take their businesses offshore. And we need to remain globally competitive, and Australia will be worse off if we lose those companies. So the way we've thought about it at SERD was really breaking it. At the moment, it's two schemes. There's a refundable offset, which is effectively under 20 million, and a rebate over 20 million. We propose splitting it into three streams, really recognizing that super young companies that are getting going need the most amount of help. So we advocated for reforms that are going to make it more attractive. And I think that's where the universities have a real role to play in those, particularly as we talk about increasing technology commercialization in universities from 4 to 10%, that there's, real opportunities in that end of the system. The middle of the system, we certainly heard a lot. There's a couple of concerns that really worried us at SERD. One was we heard from almost every business is using a tax consultant because the system is so complex that they're employing consultants to help them claim. And those consultants are typically charging between 10 and 30% of the total budget. And so when you think it's over $4 billion, that's a lot of money flowing out the door into consultancy rather than going straight to the R&D. So that was a real concern. Secondly, there's also businesses in the R&D scheme who have used it for a long time who have not grown. If you are fundamentally a research and development driven business, you need to be able to carry risk, and that risk is fair and should be rewarded. But if you've been there for years and years and years and years and years, it's no longer an incentive, it's just a government handout. And so we felt that the scheme needs to be linked to growth. And so if you're an SME, you've proven your product market fit, you deserve a rebate, you're still in that cash crunched era of your growth, but that's where you can really tie it to growth. And then at the top end of the spectrum, we certainly see a role for RDTI to better play a role in engaging our largest corporates into the R&D system. So it's not just in-house R&D, it's be good corporate actors across the system, but it's also about how do you retain them here in this country. We need our biggest R&D companies to stay here. They are great creators of R&D, they're great partners to universities, and they're also real incubators for the next generation of businesses.
Oh, absolutely. So, and having spent a couple of weeks in China last year and leading a delegation with our chair, Carolyn Evans, to Shenzhen and then into Beijing, and seeing the R&D focus on the industrial transformation in China, and then coming back to Australia, it's sobering. Let's put it that way. What we do in Australia. There's some really great questions relating to tax, but also on capital coming through from our audience. One of the challenges I see in our sector is conservatism in capital availability in Australia. I think about our own superannuation system. Matt Linden and I have talked about this for a long time. Unlocking some of the conservatism in the Australian superannuation fund could be something that we've worked on. But how do researchers and up-and-coming entrepreneurs, do you think, can work through both just the SERD recommendations, but also how can we as advocates now, both you at the Tech Council and Met UA, help change the thinking around capital, not only just through the investment funds that we're seeing in the universities, which are really important, but of course private sources of capital in the Australian context?
This is an area that I'm really passionate about, and I've run my own startup and really struggled to raise capital in this country. And it's a real challenge. But there is a really growing venture community here, and one thing that I would encourage anyone in the university environment that is really serious about growing a company is go engage with external investors. The more external early stage investors you can get in front of, the more advice you're getting. And you don't need to take all of that advice, but we certainly encourage our startups to go and speak to investors, get their feedback, be really conscious of it, and then go meet more investors. The more investors you meet, the more you're soundboarding your idea, the more you're growing. So I think going and getting out of the university system and engaging in the broader private markets, groups in Victoria like Launch Vic are playing a real role. There's fantastic groups in WA, Queensland, South Australia, often supported by government, as we were in Victoria. The groups at UTS and UNSW do a phenomenal job, but get to people who can help broaden your network outside of the university, and particularly into those angel networks and early stage venture capital funds.
And also importantly, which I'm thinking, I've seen Alex Zielinski today, getting some of that capital and investment and entrepreneurialism happening and turbocharging it in regional Australia, because we know Metropolitan it's doing a lot better on many fronts, and we want to see the know-how and capability extend to our regional universities, who are such important anchors in that space. Kate, we only have a minute left, so I can't believe it. And as I said earlier, this is such a delight to have you here on the first In Conversation as part of our Solutions series. But let's just leave you with one last provocative question or reflection. And again, thank you so much for joining us. As I say, it could be a conversation that could have gone for hours. Let's think about to the future. Australia in 10 years' time could be something, and that could be a really highly innovative, more diverse economy. How do we get there? And is SERD part of it, or is SERD the number one ticket, thing on your dance card. I'm losing my any skills of kind of using analogy, so I'll hand back over to you, Kate.
I'm obviously a bit biased, but I think SERD is absolutely the first step in that. And I think one thing we haven't touched on is cultural cringe. We should celebrate our knowledge creators, our job creators in this country, and we should be super proud and ambitious of what this country can achieve.
And like the North Americans, we should absolutely celebrate failure, because failure is where, we learn
where the learnings happen.
Our successes. Yeah, absolutely. Yep. Kate, thank you so much. Thank you generously for your time. Thank you for all the work you did on SERD. We wish you all the best of luck in the new gig at the Tech Council, and I'm sure that you'll be hearing from me and many of our members into the future. This has been a delightful conversation and a really important one. I hope you'll join me again in a future in conversation. And thank you again. And thank you so many people for joining us this afternoon and for all your questions. Stay tuned for further updates for Solution Series, and have a good afternoon, everyone. And thank you again, Kate.
Thank you for having me.